Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can go for more information about the show, to connect with us on social media, and to listen to past episodes. I think I've said it before on the show, but essentially, my opinion is, and I used to read books about the Civil War on, as a teenager. I used to be a little, kind of right-wing Civil War buff in my own little militaristic way, and it's something that's stuck in my head. I don't know if I'm ever going to get rid of that, but I've come to realize over the course of my adult life that really, ultimately, when you look at the way things played out politically and socially, the Union did not win the Civil War, and certainly, the forces of good ultimately did not triumph after the Civil War, certainly not after Reconstruction. And I forget who it was that said it, and maybe our next guest has an idea, but somebody had a line about the Senate being the South's unending revenge for Gettysburg or something like that. And I think that is true in so many other aspects of our political and social life today. I think really constitute that. We are pleased to have with us today Steve Phillips. He is the author of How We Win the Civil War, because really we haven't won the Civil War. He is also the host of a podcast, and that is called Democracy in Color with Steve Phillips. Steve, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So, we didn't really win the Civil War, did we? Or at least there have been so many compromises that have had to come, and so many steps backward from what could have been at the end of that conflict, that essentially it didn't turn out the way that one would think that it would after a conflict of that scale. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's really the essence of what I'm arguing in my book. And just to use the word compromises, because at the end, in the end of the book, I talk in the epilogue about reimagining a new social contract, and how we just imagine if we could just craft a society that was not a series of compromises with white supremacists, which is largely what we have. Even all the way back to, Thomas Jefferson tried to put in a condemnation of the slave trade in the Declaration of Independence, but as a compromise, he had to take it out with the Southern slaveholders. So that notion around we have had all of these different compromises is very front and center. And then I first started to write when I first approached about the book, I was floated the idea to my publisher, the News Press, around looking at the Civil War as a metaphor. There was so much. Right. This was April 2020, and so much division and polarization. And 8 months later, people carrying the Confederate flag, wearing sweatshirts saying MAGA Civil War, January 6, 2021, stormed the U.S. Capitol and tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power and hunt down our elected officials. Yeah. It's like, well, it's not very metaphorical anymore. And then most fundamentally, what I try to show is, there's interesting phrasing about did we win the Civil War, but right. What is entirely clear, and what I spent the first half of the book showing, is that the Confederates have never stopped fighting the Civil War.
Yeah, very true.
And that's the point that I'm really trying to drill home, and that everybody knows Lincoln was assassinated, but very few people know exactly when and exactly why. And so that's kind of left out of the descriptions of him and whatnot. The April 1865 on a Sunday was the supposed surrender ending the Civil War. Right. That Tuesday, Lincoln gives a speech from the outside of the White House saying that there should be some limited suffrage for African Americans in Louisiana. John Wilkes Booth is there at that speech, hears that, turns to the friend next to him and says, that means N-word citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever give. And then on that Friday, he sneaks into Ford Theater and shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. Yeah. That's not surrendering, right, at all. And so they have been fighting. And then you mentioned the end of Reconstruction, which is really what I think is the moment we're at now. That's what I try to frame up in the preface to this book around, I think this is 1876. Are we going to go forward towards multiracial democracy, or hand the country back to those who want to make it a white nation. So it's been going. And if you take even that chronology, assassinating Lincoln, then 10 years later, abandoning Reconstruction, giving the country back to the slaveholders for 100 years.
Yeah.
Really, it was until the 1960s that we finally were able to get rid of some of the legalized white supremacy. So the continuity of this conflict has been going on for really since 1865.
It has been, and the white supremacy that you talk about in this country, I mean, it people sometimes like to pretend. A lot of people like to pretend that, you know, our founders, you know, were good and pure people on that level, and it's just so self-evidently not true. I mean, if you talk about January 6th, and you talk about people carrying the Confederate flag in the Capitol, I remember one picture, and you may have seen it as well, where where there's this guy who's carrying a Confederate flag in the Capitol, and he's carrying it past a painting of John C. Calhoun, who and there was a statue. I don't know if it's still in Statuary Hall, but it certainly was in the Capitol for a long time. This was part of the building of the Capitol. I mean, the Capitol was built by, and the White House was built by slaves.
Right.
I mean, this is part and parcel of who this nation is, and I'm just wondering how, without uprooting that foundation, and maybe that just is what we have to do. Is there a way without thoroughly just tearing down what we have at this point, since it is so rooted in our government and in our society, can we transform into something without white supremacy, given how far back this goes?
Well, I do. It's an interesting question. I think that the answers are kind of tied together. And so what I try to show in the book is that the places that have made progress, so the whole second half of the book is about where there has been success in places that were formerly bastions of the Confederacy, including Virginia, which is the actual capital of the Confederacy, have been largely transformed, or certainly making significant progress. And so the answer, I think, is somewhat tied in together, is that the way to win is to embrace, was it Jesse Jackson used to have this phrase when he ran for president 80 about the rejected stone shall be the cornerstone of the new order. And that concept around building an electoral majority, a progressive multiracial electoral majority around voters of color in general and African Americans in particular, is what it's going to take to be able to move forward. And then to the point, that you're raising. So one of the things that Nicole Hannah-Jones talks about in the 1619 Project is how African Americans are actually the most patriotic people of all. That if there were anybody who had the right to not be patriotic, it would be African Americans, but continue to believe in the words of what this country held itself up to be. So I think there's something tied in here together in terms of being able to find our path forward by embracing those who have been the ones who have been most, demonized and exploited.
Yeah, I would think the answer would have to come from there somehow, because it's so difficult for me to wrap my head around, like, how suffused our society and a government is with racism, and then to imagine that transforming. I guess, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I thought to myself, well, we can do it because we have had things like the Civil Rights Act, and we've had things like the Voting Rights Act, and we've engaged in transformation. And I guess over the course of the last few years, I have become more pessimistic about whether that is possible or not. And I guess ultimately the answer has to be provided on a certain level by people who have suffered the worst that this system can dish out, and I wonder what you see and what you think others see about, like, what is possible and how it can be transformed. Because when you look at the institutions that have been created, when you look at the U.S. Senate, when you look at the electoral structure and how entrenched that is there a way of turning it without breaking down those things which were so thoroughly designed to impose the white supremacy and the imbalanced power structure that we have? Even though things like the 3/5 compromise are gone, there's so many roots that are still there. Like, do we have to break down the U.S. Senate? Do we have to restructure the government? Do we have to thoroughly overhaul the Constitution? I mean, those are things that I frankly see at this point as a necessity. But maybe you see a way of rehabilitating them. What is your perspective?
Well, I do think we have to conceptually think broadly, right? I've been reminded of the Bob Marley song, right? Emancipate yourself from mental slavery, right? So for instance, like take the Supreme Court. I didn't even realize till I was researching this, the size of the Supreme Court has been changed 7 different times in the history of this country.
Right.
In that all it takes is a majority vote in Congress on the signature of the president. So if the Democrats hold the House and they take back the House and hold the Senate, and Biden wins re-election, they could expand the size of the Supreme Court from 9 to 14, put 5 new people on immediately, and then all of this effort where you have all of these legal decisions, which are both against precedent. I mean, I went to law school. I'm a lawyer. And so this concept of stare decisis, you're supposed to defer to prior decisions, is completely out the window. So that's all out the window. And then there's just they're making decisions which are contrary to what most people want. We're seeing it particularly like with Roe v. Wade and things like that. So we could reverse all of that in a matter of months in 2025 if we would expand our mindset and not be bound in that fashion. And then fundamentally, I also think there's a lesson from the Obama years and Obamacare and healthcare. So I don't think we're going to change anybody's mind, and that's one of the points that I'm really trying to impress upon people. But we have the numbers to get power to pass policies that benefit everybody.
Right.
And so even people who voted against Obama were entitled to get health care from him. And we lose sight of that as well. If people think about like the Montgomery bus boycott in Rosa Parks, and they boycotted so that African Americans could ride the bus. That actually wasn't. It was just so that everybody could ride the bus.
Right.
And so that's really, I think, the potential, like you're saying, leaning into and leaning on those who experience it most intensely, because they're the ones who will let us know when we've gotten there yet and won't falter prematurely. But when we do that, the potential is there to reconfigure our society in ways that are beyond the scope of what our current thinking is.
You talked about the Supreme Court just now, and you made an excellent point that all it takes is a majority of Congress and the signature of the president. And I thought about how today the congressman from Colorado, Ken Buck, announced that he was going to retire early, which means like one less vote in the House of Representatives, where the Republicans have a 2 or 3 vote majority, and how it's not inconceivable, since with the Senate the way it is, essentially in Democratic control, and if that margin were to slip any further, it could conceivably happen even this year. I mean, we are that close if there is the will to do it, if there is the willingness to push that. And yet that seems so far away from the standard political conceptions that we have in this country. But if you think about it in terms of that's just a matter of perception and not a matter of law, how close we are, how thoroughly things could change, that really is an amazing kind of thought. All it would take is a couple of votes in the House of Representatives and just the will to do that, to say this is important and we need to change this structure. We could actually do it. We're not that far away if we're